Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our COVID-19 webinar follow-up series. My name is Holly Foxworth, and I'm also joined by Axiom's President and CEO, Mark Robinson. Welcome to the live stream, Mark. I appreciate you joining.
Hey, thanks. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, Mark, I'd be remiss if I failed to point out that everything that you just shared and alerted us to last week in the webinar seems to be playing out this week in terms of the rising cases that are coming up and some of the dangers that are really associated with complacency. Do you really feel like that we're continuing on the same pathway, the same trajectory in terms of cases rising and kind of the dangers that are occurring in the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. What we've seen since last week is we're now up to 33 individual states that have rising case counts and hospitalizations. And last week, 7 states set new single-day records for the number of new cases. I wish that were better news. I hate the fact that this is true, but I hate the fact that I was right, and I didn't want to be right. I wanted to be horribly wrong. But the truth is that this disease is definitely getting a second wind. And the consequences for many places and many people will be really uncomfortable. And we're already seeing some local governments beginning to take actions to reduce and control some of the refreshed liberties that people have been allowed over the last few weeks since we kind of reopened. And I suspect that more states, more counties, more municipalities will start taking more actions over the next few weeks.
Right. Well, interestingly, some of the questions that we had that came up this week in the webinar were very similar to some of the initial conversations and education we provided very early on in the pandemic.
Right.
The first one that was there was actually related to temperature screenings. And so we had where the audience members had asked, can we perform our own temperature screenings, or is that something that really has to be done by a third party? Do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, the answer is yes. You could possibly perform your own temperature screenings, and I do know of quite a few businesses that are doing that. The concern that I would have as a business leader is that whilst knowing whether somebody is running a fever or not is not protected health information specifically, knowing the exact degree of fever, the exact temperature that they're running, that potentially is private health information and protected. And not every person in your workplace is entitled to access that. And you as a business are not really entitled to know it or make use of it. So if you're going to run temperature screenings yourself, then you really need to be taking great care to protect that data from an unauthorized access or use. You have to treat it the same way that you would treat any other super confidential employee data, i.e. probably only a person in your HR team designated as a person who can know and should know that, should know it.
Great. The next one was asking about what maybe would need to be included in some of the policies and procedures that would be related to enforcing a wellness culture where employees are not coming to work feeling ill.
Yeah, look, you can't enforce culture. You can enforce behavior, but you can't enforce culture. You have to nurture and grow culture. So I think policies and procedures are kind of, they're the walls, the buffer that keeps people on track. And of course, you should have fairly strong policies and procedures that determine exactly how people are required to behave in the workplace to reduce the risk of COVID transmission, or to reduce the risk that they bring that disease into the workplace at all. And those policies should include the potential for disciplinary action up to and including termination for employees who knowingly and willfully enter the workplace with an infectious disease where they have been informed of the policy that they are not to enter the workplace in those circumstances. But far more important, I think, than having those is also having a culture where you encourage employees to be protective of one another. You encourage employees to care about their co-workers, not just their co-workers, but their co-workers' families and friends outside the workplace, because If you selfishly go to work whilst you have symptoms consistent with COVID, and it turns out that that's what it is, and you infect a coworker, you don't know that that coworker doesn't have their 90-year-old great-grandmother living in the home with them. You don't know that their spouse doesn't have an immune disease, an autoimmune disease that leaves them with a compromised immune system. You basically don't know anything about the circumstances that that person that you infected may be taking the disease home to. So inadvertently, and clearly not intentionally, but selfishly, you expose somebody to infection, they become infected, they infect other people, and down the line, people can die from that or have to be hospitalized with severe illness. So I think just encouraging that culture of caring and responsibility and sharing how you understand the risks and why, and this is critical of any policy, why are you asking it of people? What's the benefit to them and others? Policies cannot and must not be arbitrary. They should be created in the context of a real driving reason, and everybody involved in creating the policy or explaining the policy should be totally willing to give that rationale, to explain it, to give examples of why it's important. And then really importantly, leadership has to live it, right? Leadership has to adopt the exact same standards, be walking examples of how to behave.
Great information. I really like what you mentioned about, understanding the why. The next one was about testing and the questions that come up about, should mass testing be performed for ongoing surveillance? What's your thoughts on that one?
That's a yes, no, maybe. So look, some businesses, some organizations, some workplaces are subject to regulations where mass testing is being required. We're seeing more and more of that. There are CDC guidelines coming out that basically say for certain essential businesses where close proximity between workers is required and where the likelihood of transmission is high, that those workers should be regularly tested. We're also seeing agreements come into place between worker representatives and their employers, for example, in the entertainment industry, where very frequent testing is being required because of the close, even intimate proximity between individuals who are working on a production. So in those cases, that's a yes. You should do it, must do it, in fact, or you have to suspend your operation. Generally speaking, testing has not yet hit the threshold where I would regard it as adequate on its own, or even close to adequate on its own as your preventive measure. Your primary preventive measure should be screening and attestation as to health, daily, every time somebody wants to enter the workplace. And here's the reason. A lot of mass testing is being done with home test kits. Home test kits, there's two kinds of testing. There's PCR testing, which is basically a gene sequencing test, which is done from mucus collected from the respiratory tract. When a professional does this, they shove a swab so far up your nose that your brain hurts. It is not fun at all. You're very unlikely to do that efficiently and effectively yourself. So the sample you gather is not necessarily going to be representative of your actual state of health. There are approximately 30% false negatives with PCR testing, which means 30% of your employees could be coming to work actively infected and not have caught that infection with a PCR test. We've then got serology tests for antibodies, and those tests are newer to us than the PCR test, which is the most established form of COVID testing. The accuracy of those tests varies significantly, but the World Health Organization published a comment a few weeks ago now that some of those tests have accuracy levels as low as 50%. And you know, I as a business leader, as a human responsible for helping protect the lives of other humans, I am not going to rely on that as my one barrier to entry for individuals who are going to come into my workplace.
And the final question that we had, Mark, was related to some of the contact tracing. The question was, are public health departments and employers sharing this role of contact tracing in the event that there was a positive case that had occurred in the workplace?
Yeah, that's another yes, no, maybe. Public health in America is mostly organized at the county level, and in some cases at the city level. And, you know, there are 7,200 counties in the US. I can't remember how many significant metropolitan areas there are and how many towns and cities there are, but it's a huge number. And the variability between how each of those is approaching public health in their domain is significant. So some public health officers in some jurisdictions are actively involving themselves in workplace-based infections, in contact tracing, in investigating the procedures and protocols that were in place that allowed that infection, in trying to determine whether in fact that infection occurred in the workplace or occurred elsewhere. But that is not consistent. And if you're an organization that has a high rate of infection and you want to continue to operate, you have to be thinking about and executing on your own contact tracing processes. You have to be cognizant of your obligation to inform people who may have been exposed in your workplace about that exposure, and assess through inquiry the degree of exposure they actually had and whether that exposure constitutes a material risk. And if it does, it's on you to exclude that person from the workplace until that risk has passed.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. Great information that you shared in the webinar, and also for joining us today, answering these additional questions. Just a few quick mentions before we go. I did want to mention that on Thursday at 1 o'clock p.m. Central, we're going to be co-hosting a webinar with Athena Security addressing emerging health technology specific to temperature screening. So this is not a webinar that you want to miss. If you haven't already, please make sure that you sign up for that. But also send us your town hall questions. You can send those to coronavirus@axiom.com. And also, if you're looking for additional information about risk mitigation, some of the return to work strategies, Chuck Cable, Axiom's chief legal and HR officer, has authored an excellent white paper that's called The World After COVID-19. You can access a free copy of that publication on our website. And as always, should you have any questions regarding Axiom's Check Into Work app or the Contagious Respiratory Illness Program, please reach out to us. We're happy to walk you through it or answer any questions that you have. So thank you again for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you Thursday at the webinar. Stay safe.